All right, there you go. So it's going to be a big day. We're looking forward to that much later today. So we've got two gentlemen here with us to shed some light and give us their professional perspective on that presentation and expectations from the 2020 budget. Well, yes, we do have Mr. Bayo Rotimi here with us. He's a financial consultant, also of the Quest Advisory Services. Then Mr. Shino Sipasi joins us here as well. He's a partner with Alex Legal Practitioners and Arbitrators. Gentlemen, good to see you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Well, some of the projections, as we've seen highlighted in that report, as a result of the MTEF FSP, 10.7 trillion will be presented, but we don't know if that's how it will be passed at the end of the day, because the back and forth will always happen. But Mr. Rotimi, this yearly ritual now, you know, we always ask the big question, how does it resonate with the people? So first of all, give us your impression about some of these budget projections.
Thank you very much. I think, as always, you know, we've gone round this cycle a few times. A budget bottom line is a statement of intent. So you must always measure that intent with actual performance. So as we're starting to look at the 2020 budget, maybe it is useful to look at the prior years and see to what extent have we delivered on this statement of intent that we put before the Nigerian people. Interestingly, the 2019 budget became operational in July of this year. So we actually have a budget that is going to run up until June of 2020. So we're just 3 months into the life of the current budget. We still have another 9 months. You know, so whilst I appreciate the conversation and the debate around the 2020, I think it is important that we do not lose sight of 2019. So on a month-on-month basis, we need to be holding government accountable to say the 2019 budget that is already an act of parliament, to what extent have we delivered in the first quarter? And what you will find out, Chamberlain, is that there is a significant disparity between the revenue projections and the actuals. You know, this current year we are going into, there are significant headwinds ahead of us. We must be asking ourselves, to what extent is government coming up with policies to help us cushion the impact of these headwinds? Headwind number one, minimum wage that we are struggling to fund. Yeah. Headwind number two, electricity tariffs that have gone up and still need to go up. Headwind number three, ultimately, is this big elephant in the room called the fuel subsidy that we do not have the capacity to continue to deal with. If you add all of this to certain moves by government to increase VAT, communication taxes and all, there are significant issues ahead. So there is a lot to talk about.
Mr. Sipasi.
Well, basically, while I agree that we have significant issues ahead, I think it is good to actually appreciate what the government is trying to do this time around to ensure that we return the country back to the normal and the usual budget cycle, where the budget cycle will run from January till December. I think that effort should be commended. But just like he had mentioned, apart from returning back to the normal budget cycle, it is important that government pays attention to ensuring that resources are devoted to sectors and areas that will actually make significant impact in the lives of the people.
Perhaps one of the challenges that have been raised over time is that of who monitors the budget performance and how the budget performance is being monitored. Part of what is often the culture is that the president will say every ministry, department, and agency will look at the budget, pick up what is theirs, and follow through accordingly. So question, who monitors? How is the budget monitored to ensure that it delivers on its promises? I think that's one of the issues. How do you think we have fared in that regard?
So basically, there's the budget office, which is responsible for setting up the fundamental basis and the principles that all the MDAs are expected to follow when it comes to setting their budget and also when it comes to the implementation of their budget. So within the executive arm of government, there's a monitoring process to ensure that to ensure that that budgets are realistically set and they are also realistically implemented. But another level of measurement that we should expect, if the National Assembly plays its proper role, is that the oversight function of the National Assembly is actually a critical part in ensuring that budgets are properly monitored.
On what Mr. Rotimi said about reconciling the fact that, look, 3 months into the budget, which is ongoing, yes, you want to reconcile, come up with a good budget cycle. That is a very important component, important factor. How do we reconcile? Are we going to sacrifice this so that you get a regularized yearly budget?
No, I don't think. I don't think this has to be sacrificed. Let me look at it from the perspective of a lawyer. The budget that had been passed is an act of parliament. And an act of parliament can always be amended to achieve a set objective. And budgets are figures, projections, and they've been passed into law. For purposes of harmonization, the figures don't have to change. The assessment can still be done. And while the assessment is being done, proper amendment can be made to that act, and what should happen in 2020 plus what has been projected can be harmonized and passed into something.
What do you see happening, given those concerns that you raised, if this 2020 budget is eventually passed in record time?
My view is this: as desirable as a January to December budget cycle is, the reality is every budget has a 12-month lifespan. So we should still be able to measure the implementation of that budget. So we have a current budget now that started in July of 2019 and will run until June of 2020. And we've had budgets in the last 10, forever, how many years? What is important, and I think what Nigerians should focus on, is how do we hold government and indeed the National Assembly accountable to the budget numbers that have been presented? Yes, we recognize that a budget is an estimate, but we must also do everything possible to challenge government to do what is necessary to deliver on that budget. We still cannot be budgeting, having 70% of our revenues going towards recurrent expenditure. We still cannot be pushing significantly high budget deficits that we will have to go and borrow and increase our already over-bloated debt profile, to the extent that most of our revenues will now go towards debt service. So there are significant issues that we need to focus on.
I mean, you've raised about 2 or 3 of those issues, but I'd like to go back to that, ratio for recurrent and capital spending. I'm just trying to imagine, and I'm sure a lot of Nigerians are curious, what is the thinking of the government, for having that sort of ratio, capital to recurrent? I mean, we're trying to plan for the future, but with this sort of ratio, where does that leave us?
Thank you very much. We have the Minister of Finance presented a medium-term expenditure framework to the National Assembly to cover the next 3 years. Sadly, in that document, this ratio is largely maintained. The majority of our revenues are still going to be devoted towards government overhead. So the question is, how many people exist in this entire government ecosystem? We have a population of 200 million. I dare say the entire public service cannot be 5 million Nigerians. So why will 70% of our revenues be servicing 5 million Nigerians? The way out is this, government, my view is this. this particular administration, the Buhari government, has an opportunity to do things right. Fortunately, he is not seeking a third term. So this is his final opportunity. There are a lot of hard decisions that need to be made, decisions that we have been running away from for decades. If this man wants to write his name in gold, let him take some of those hard decisions. The 5 or so million people in the public service, there has to be a proper audit done by private sector entities to first of all determine that do we have these 5 million people? Do all of these 5 million people have clear job descriptions? Are they clearly adding value to the Nigerian economy? Are they justifying the 70% of our revenues that we're allocating to them? I suspect that the answer will be no.
But you know, looking at history, historians always have this. You know what a man can do by what he's done before. Recent history. Take, for instance, Ministry of Power, Works and Housing. Now, Ministry of Works and Housing, power separate. You have some of the new ministries that have come on board. And you thought that we were talking about merging ministries to ensure that we reduce overheads. But this recent history doesn't support that, look, we're moving towards reducing this overhead cost, does it?
Certainly not. So again, it is tragic that we're still having this conversation in 2019. We know what to do. What consistently is lacking is the political will to do it. In the first 4 years of this government, the Buhari administration, the number of budgets were reduced. We did not go the full hog. There was a gentleman, the former SSG, who prepared who headed a committee that looked at how to rationalize and merge ministries, departments, and agencies. The policies are still there. The recommendations are on site. That was what I was trying to refer to. The recommendations are still there. It is a matter of public record. Let us simply implement that. But what is even particularly painful to me is that in this current budget, or in this current second term, we've increased the number of ministries rather than reduce. There is something not quite right.
I don't know if it will be possible for the National Assembly to fulfill their promise of merging about 700 MDAs. But if that...
Is it their responsibility?
Well, I'm wondering how that will also be played. But one other thing that's giving a number of people concern is the debt servicing load. It increased marginally between 2018 and 2019. How do we even begin to deal with that one?
Well, as long as you consistently fail to hit your revenue targets and you are not willing to reduce your expenditure, the only option available to you is to borrow, which is why our budgets consistently have deficits. So the 2020 budget has a deficit figure of 2.45 trillion naira, right? But what you will find out in reality is that that figure will ultimately be higher because, like I said earlier, we always struggle to meet the revenue targets. But whilst we are not meeting revenue targets, we struggle to bring down our expenditure. The expenditure budget is always close to 100% at the end of every budgeting cycle. So we will still have to borrow. So the only way to reduce that borrowing load is for us to make some deliberate attempts to bring down the cost of governance. Then more importantly, for critical infrastructure, which government cannot fund by itself on its own balance sheet, bring in private sector participation, concession a lot of things, public-private partnerships, and let private capital come into this economy.
I'd like to stay with that, debt servicing. Now, Mr. CPC, just to paint the picture, in 2018, imagine we got about 3.5 trillion naira revenue, and that's about half of what we projected to get. That's on one hand. And out of that 3.5 trillion naira, we used 2.2 trillion, which is like a large chunk of it, to service our debt. That's on one hand. And you begin to wonder how much is even left to achieve what we want to achieve. So we're in a situation where we need to lift 100 million people out of poverty. Because, the talk about budget should filter down to the people on the streets. So with this budget you're looking at, or at least the proposal you've seen so far, how much how many people do you think you can even lift out of poverty with what you have seen so far?
Lifting people out of poverty is not something that is going to be solved or that is going to result only from the budget. But the budget can actually play a lot in that direction.
So how much role will this budget play in that?
Well, this budget by itself cannot achieve much. I was looking at the figures. They're looking at a projected revenue. The government is looking at a projected revenue of about of less than 8 billion, and we're looking at expenditure of, now I think about 10.7 billion. If history serves us right, we're not likely to hit that revenue target. So basically, there will be more borrowing and there'll be more debt to service in subsequent years. However, lifting people out of revenue is not just the responsibility of government. If the government does the right thing and incentivize, allows the private sector to play its role, people are going to be lifted out of poverty in the first place when they have jobs to do.
But many businesses, pardon me for jumping in, Mr. Sipasi, many businesses are crying under the burden of a lot of, choking taxes, levies, and stuff like that. So many of them are finding it difficult to even stay afloat in business.
So basically, this is where creative thinking is required.
Creative thinking
by government, because it is government really that creates the environment. You have to look at the environment. You have to look at the businesses. Yes, taxes are important, but then taxes can also be means of unlocking private capital and private activity. How exactly should taxes be deployed? What are the activities to be taxed? How can you use taxation to incentivize certain types of behavior? How can you use incentives to ensure that certain businesses that ordinarily wouldn't have taken off would take off? What are the incentives that can be given to motivate people to go into productive activities? What are the critical infrastructure? There are a lot of infrastructural need that we need, but what are the critical infrastructure that we need to target to ensure that maybe agricultural potential in the hinterland is unlocked? What are the things that can be done, for instance, to ensure that we don't continue to have this massive migration from the rural area to the city? What are the things that can be done to ensure that farm produce, things that are produced in Modakeke, for instance, can easily get to Lagos the same day or a day after, to ensure that things don't perish? And in this way, we can unlock economic activities in different aspects of the economy. So it's not just the budget, it's also about the different policy initiatives and implementation that the government rolls out.
All right, so we'll go to break and then we'll return and take a look at some of those projections, some of those that stick out like a sore thumb. How will they approach it? Of course, revenue generation also at the center of it all. Join us again. Welcome back. Well, yes, indeed. Today, we expect the president to present the 2020 budget to the joint session of the National Assembly. So there are some projections that haven't seen the MTEF approved. So you see how the National Assembly is expecting, or what, who knows, will also come through today. National Assembly, of course, they always do, they do this. They say, look, we have responsibility to ensure that some of these things are done. So raising that proposal from 10.002 trillion, look at the current figure there. The benchmark of crude usually happens time and again. And then in terms of revenue generation, look at what they've done to that of the customs there. So that's the target that they raised it to, what they expect. But then they retain the exchange rates, 305 to the dollar. All benchmark, you see that as well. And then the adoption of 1.5 trillion new borrowing by federal government, which is a key component. I do remember, I think the last time out, when the government was talking about how they needed to free up capital for the private sector to operate and do certain things. Well, it may be 3 months down the line, but what kind of performance have you seen that action? Is it bearing any fruit yet?
Okay, thank you very much. Just looking at the key highlights, a few talking points, Chamberlain. I think first good thing is oil production. We dropped from 2.3 to 2.18. My view, that figure is still a bit ambitious because on average we're doing about 1.9 thereabouts. So I would still have preferred a more conservative production figure. The National Assembly increased the budget size by 700 billion. I disagree with that position. The adjustment, upward adjustment in the benchmark oil prices, I also disagree. If you listen to the Minister of Finance, she said the reason behind the adoption of a $55 per barrel was because of the anticipated glut in 2020. That 3 major players in the global oil space, OPEC, the International Energy Agency, and somebody else have spoken extensively about the likelihood of a glut next year. So I don't think against that background, we should have increased the benchmark from 55 to 57. So already, you are already putting the budget under pressure from day one because some of the assumptions may not be realistic, they may not be achievable. So I think in this whole process and in the dynamics between the executive and the legislature, I think that some close interactions must take place. So I would like the executive to vigorously defend this position when they engage with the National Assembly. Let's try and bring this budget back to 10. Even it should be below 10 because our revenues cannot support a 10 trillion naira
So those
budget.
projections, revenue projections notwithstanding?
Notwithstanding, because ultimately what we're saying is instead of 1.5 trillion naira borrowing, you will see significantly higher than that because the economy cannot deliver on the revenue expectations.
Against what background do you think the National Assembly made these assumptions then?
Well, the National Assembly, with due respect to them, I think they are particularly optimistic in a lot of their outlook. They tend to favor from history bigger budgets. They have always pushed up the budgetary estimates. My view, not necessary. It is better to go with a budget of 10 and let us outperform rather than from day one increase it by 700 without clarity around where the funding will come from.
Mr. Sipasi, do you think their interface with those MDAs might have given them a hunch or two saying, look, from what we've seen here, because they reference customs, they say, look, if they've been able to perform, why shouldn't we just jack it up?
Well, I don't know exactly the detail of their interaction with the MDA, but there are quite a number of things that that historically drive the National Assembly in changing the number or increasing the number that the executives. Well, that's part of it, but also I think they're usually sensitive to political spread. So they look at the different budget implementation, and they may be feeling that while a section of the country had been served by a budgetary allocation, another section has not been properly served, and as a result of that, they begin to change numbers and sometimes reallocate numbers, basically in a bid to satisfy their larger constituency. There are over 500 people in the National Assembly, so and many people come to the table with different demands. So we see this play out year in, year out. However, I think the executive has to find a way of convincing them of perhaps explaining the strategic reasons why resources are allocated in particular ways.
But gentlemen, I need you both to comment on this. Some of the key things, because we will talk about how do these budgets affect the people. some of the key talking points before now, VAT, increasing VAT, the minimum wage, it's out there. Is it catered for in the budget? That was part of the excuse they had the last time out. Fuel subsidy, the elephant in the room. Who's going to talk about all of those? Are they paying it or not? Did they give it another name to mask it? How will all of these things be viewed in this budget?
I believe that it is ultimately down to the Nigerian people. My view is that governments have been consistent in the way they do things. And if we truly want some kind of change in this country, it is now the people that have to push for increased openness, hold government accountable for a lot of the promises. My view is that the budget, I've said it earlier, is a statement of intent. To what extent is there the will to deliver on the budgetary aspirations? Now, if you still have a situation where we're spending in excess of ₦1 trillion to subsidize petrol, not petroleum products, just one product, petrol. Diesel has been deregulated, it is market determined. My view, this is the time to deal with this. Yes, I understand the issues around the level of poverty in the land. They say that we have 98 million people living in extreme poverty. Where we are today, there are no easy solutions, but I would rather that the people are sacrificing for something that will yield positive benefit in the medium term.
That's a bone of contention.
It's interesting because now there's a federal government, but then we have the state and local governments who are much closer to the people. So when we have, appropriations and budgets such as this, how should states and local governments key into it? Well, there's the ERGP also, which is, much broader. So, Mr. Asipasi, how do you think states, local governments can find a way to, yes, they have their budgets, but then key into it such that it trickles down from the top to the people?
In fact, I think we need to start placing as much emphasis on states and local government as we place on the federal government. The reason is that a larger percentage of the revenue that is being made by the government actually goes to the, when you aggregate what goes to the state and to the local government, actually it's a larger percentage. The share of the federal government is slightly smaller than what the aggregate of the shares of the states, what the states receive. So there's a lot that can be done at that level. And if the states and the federal government get the kind of focus, serious focus that the federal government gets,
and local government.
Yes, states and local government, with respect to how they use their revenue and how they plan, if they are held to account, if people are interested in the revenue they get on a month-to-month basis, and also their internally generated revenue, if they are held to account on those things, it will be easier. It will be easier to actually make much impact on those levels.
Forgive me, Mr. Asipasi, it's one of the challenges a number of people may have looked at because, well, it's a good idea to hold them to account. The question is how?
Advocacy, constant discussion like this, helping the local people, those of us who live in the states, and people who live in the local government to be aware that there's something we can do. It starts from us being aware that we have a right to ask and starting to ask the right questions from our councillors, from our local government representatives, and also from our representatives in the different houses of assembly.
Now, if I may bring Mr. Bayorotimi in for a moment. Now, interestingly, everybody stays in a local government, in a state and in a federal, of course, in Nigeria. So it's not as though some people stay in states and some stay in local government. And, this conversation is ongoing. But then from your perspective too, how can states, local governments key into this?
Earlier on, I said Mr. President has an opportunity to make some fundamental changes. I think the structure of Nigeria, the structure of governance in Nigeria has to change, right? We have 36 states. 2/3 of them are unviable today, right? They are totally dependent on statutory allocations. Much as I disagree with Rochas Okorocha on many things, I have to agree with him this time around with regard to the size of the National Assembly. Do we need 500 and something odd legislators? Do we need 2 houses of the legislative arm? Do we need full-time legislators? Do we need 36 states? Right? So I think there is a need for some fundamental restructuring of the polity. So this, in my view, is the time to do this. Remove political considerations. Let us look at the future benefit of Nigerians. The governance structure we have today is too expensive.
Do you see the possibility of removing those political considerations? And we'll come back to some of that. But there's something you said about the states and all of that. There is no state in Nigeria that does not have enough deposits and natural resources and agricultural potential.
Correct.
So why is it difficult to be able to aggregate all of these energies, potential that all these states have?
Yeah, because the political structure is faulty. Because we do not get the best candidates to become governors or deputy governors or commissioners or local government chairmen. Because the Constitution has conferred immunity on them. So for 4 years or 8 years, they can run roughshod over their people. Nobody can question them. They can allocate to themselves a security vote that is not audited by anybody.
So it's not because the states are not viable.
Yes, it is. Well, they are not. The result is the lack of viability. But what the foundation, what created that situation was when we have political leaders who are not accountable to the people who elected them into office. So they believe that the commonwealth of the state belongs to them and they appropriate it as they deem fit. And that is the problem. So we have to tweak that political structure and de-emphasize the power that the governor or the average public official has.
So then, on the one hand, the president is, on the one hand is what Mr. Rotimi has said. On the other hand, Mr. Sipasi, is the call by the president earlier in the year for partnership between the federal government and the states. Do you see that's happening?
Yes. I see it happening, and I think it should happen.
In the light of what Mr. Rotimi has said?
Yes, I see it happening, and I think it should happen. And there have been quite a number of instances where the federal government have successfully partnered with the state. If the government, and when I say the government, I'm looking at all the 3 levels of government, will achieve the aim of bringing people out of poverty, it is going to be a concerted effort. And I think that there are critical areas that must be focused on, not really hard stuff, but really soft areas like education. I think if we have a populace that is well educated, people are going to start getting freer.
What's the definition for well educated?
Well literate.
From well,
let's say at least up to secondary school level.
okay.
Properly literate. So education. It's more difficult to manipulate people who are educated. When people are educated, it is easier for them to actually have a broader view about life and be able to make some good decision with respect to themselves and also with respect to their communities. Another issue, and I know the federal government had been making an effort around this, is the issue of access to credit, although we need to be creative about it. And when I say access to credit to
What creativity do we need other than part of it, including reducing the interest rate?
Oh,
there we
well,
go.
interest rate is
Yeah.
one thing, but one of the big barrier to access to credit is because the people who will issue the credit don't have a way of verifying the identity of the debtor.
Banks?
Well, the banks, the microfinance agencies.
How
and so
don't they have a way of verifying?
It's difficult. I mean, KYC is expensive, especially when you look at the number of people that credit have to be extended to. It's actually a whole lot of people that require credit in order to be able to start one small business or the other.
Yeah.
However, extending credit is not an easy thing because you need to understand or you need to know the person that you're extending credit to, and you also need to be reasonably persuaded that the person
Well,
is going
winding
to pay
down now,
back,
but
yeah.
Mr. Rotimi, what do you think of this?
Well, my view is the MSME sector, they constitute the largest proportion of the Nigerian economy. Access to credit is one of the challenges they face, but their challenges go beyond that. It is also important. We talk about the ease of doing business, and access to credit is just one out of about 6 or 7 indicators. So the lack of infrastructure that we talk about, the lack of sanctity of contracts, the volatility in government policies and all of that. These are all of the issues. So it takes concerted effort. It takes significant political will to move the needle forward. Unfortunately, time is running out. More and more Nigerians are getting into poverty. The economy is struggling, so something needs to be done right away.
Yeah, and time has run out on us as well here this morning. Mr. Bayo Rotimi, financial consultant, and Mr. Shino Sipasi, a partner with Alex Legal Practitioners and Arbitrators. Gentlemen, thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you.